devotees, welcome back once again. Namo Om Vishnu Padaya, Krishna Pashtaya Bhutale, Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane. Namaste Saraswati Deve, Gauravani Pacharine, Nivishesha Shunyavadi Pastimes Shatarine. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. So, today will be our final lecture on our series about Srila Rupa Goswami's beloved deity of Govindaji or Govindaji. Next Friday we'll discuss about Madan Mohan, Srila Sanatana Goswami's deity, while he was in Jaipur and later moved to Karoli. And after that, the next lectures, we'll get back to our wanderings in Vrindavan. I'm looking forward to that. So to conclude this series today, I'd like to focus on several of the servants of Govindaji. Again, certainly that is not any less important than focusing on Govindaji himself. Gaur Govinda Maharaj, he used to chant the following Bengali shloka: Vaishnavera Gunagana Karile Jivana Trana Shunayache Shadu Guru Mukhe. It's a beautiful verse. Quote, I've heard from the mouth of sadhus and guru that by glorifying Vaishnavas, one delivers oneself from the material world. Unquote. Of course, the main personality we have focused on all along is Srila Rupa Goswami. And surely much more could be said about him. Just yesterday in the Vrindavan Research Institute, I came across several prayers to Rupa Goswami by a devotee whose name was Govardhan Bhatta Goswami. He was one of the prominent Goswamis in the line of Raghunath Bhatta Goswami's para. And he lived during the time of Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur. And this Govardhan Bhatta Goswami, he wrote a commentary on the Srimad Bhagavatam. And in the introduction he writes so sweetly, quote, my greatest good fortune is that Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur and I are friends forever. My greatest good fortune is that Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur and I are friends forever. Wow. Now, Govardhan Bhatta Goswami wrote another book called Govardhan Bhatta Goswami Granthavali. It's divided into 3 parts. And the third part is called Shri Rupa Sanatan Stotra, in which there are, I think I counted 54 shlokas, only glorifying Rupa and Sanatan Goswamis. We don't have time for 52, or we should make time, let us say. But here's 2 of those verses, glorifying in particular Shri Rupa Goswami. Quote, who can achieve the shelter of the lotus feet of Sri Radha without the association of Sri Rupa Goswami? By hearing his beautiful compositions and by looking at his incomparable pearl-like handwriting, Lord Chaitanya happily dances while glorifying and praising him with all the devotees. Unquote. Next verse, quote, today Sri Rupa is residing in Sri Vrindavan, being more humble than a blade of grass and more tolerant than a tree. He is holding a clay pot in one hand and a woolen shawl on his shoulder. He is singing the pastimes of Radhakanta, while sometimes sitting in the shadow of a kalpavriksha tree, constantly chanting the names of Krishna, and every day he begs from the house of Brahmanas. Unquote. I was also reading in another author's book in the Institute that whenever Rupa Goswami or the other Goswamis would receive new cloth, they would dig a hole on the bank of the Jamuna, put the cloth inside, mix it with Jamuna water, making a really muddy solution, and a few days later, they would come and they would take out the cloth and wash it in the flowing Jamuna River. And as a result, the clothes they wore, which wasn't much, they had a loincloth and a chadar, basically, that's what you could say. But as a result of treating the cloth in that way, their clothes were a light brown color, a light brown color. And this was the color that the 6 Goswamis would wear. I thought that was interesting. I also read that Srila Rupa Goswami, he preferred to wear a black colored woolen chadar over his left shoulder in the winter time. There's a detail for you. So now we'll discuss some lesser known, but certainly important servitors of Govindaji after the departure of Jai Singh II. So I was reading that before Jai Singh died, he arranged all the ceremonies for worshiping Govindaji. Personally, he oversaw that and made sure that all the prominent festivals of the year would be performed in a grand way. So all the kings that came after him, even down to the present day, they're still following the same schedule, you could say, that Jai Singh established. Now, after Jai Singh, his eldest son, Ishwar Singh, became the king. And he religiously continued the seva of Govindaji, exactly as his father had done. And after he departed, his son became king. And his name was Madhava Singh I. And it's written that he was especially devoted to Govindaji. I found a document where his court scribes describe his daily activities. Well, this is, in this particular part, it's his morning activities. They wrote, and I quote, "Our king, Madhava Singh, sits in a palanquin which is carried by servants. Starting from Chandra Palace, the palanquin heads towards Govindadev's temple. Some trained dancers welcome King Madhava Singh at the gates of the temple with a beautiful dance performance. The king, arriving at the doors of Govindadev, donates golden coins to the dancers. Then the king, who was born in the Kurma lineage, walks inside the temple with utmost humility. There he waits for the boga offering and watches the performance of arati. Then he offers his obeisances and offers gifts of gold coins and ornaments to the lotus feet of Govindadev. At last he takes blessings from Govindadev for the well-being of his kingdom." Isn't that nice? It's the king's daily routine. Now after Madhava Singh I, his son, Pratap Singh I, ruled Jaipur. And he was also a great devotee of Govindaji, like father, like son. It is said that every night Govindaji would appear to him in a dream. And that earned him the nickname, people had a nickname for their king, Braja Nidhi. Braja means Vrindavan, and Nidhi means treasure. So each night he dreamt of Govindaji, the treasure of Vrindavan. And Pratap Singh's daily life is also described by his court, one of his court poets, in a work entitled Pratapa Prakasha. Pratapa Prakasha. And I'll quote part of that. Pratapa Prakasha. Having bathed and dressed after waking, Pratap Singh's first act of the day was to go and see Govindadev. Riding on a palanquin, he went from Chandra Mahal, the palace of the moon, to Jayanivas, and then soon arrived at Govinda's temple. He made an offering and had darshan of the Lord, and when the priest performed artik, Pratap Singh took the water from the conch. Then he would circumambulate Govindaji and, standing before the Lord, recite Sanskrit shlokas that he himself had composed the day before. Wow. The king was fluent in Sanskrit and composed verses for Govindaji, which he would sing each morning before his day began in front of the Lord. And then he would bow down and pay full obeisances to the Lord. And then what? And then what? Then, still early morning, he would go to his private quarters in his palace, to his altar room. And from 5:30 a.m. to 12 p.m., or noontime, every day, he would worship his personal black stone deity of Krishna, whom he also called Govindaji. And during that period, he had a rule that if anyone, even his own queen, came and disturbed him, they would be subjected to severe chastisement. He did not want to be disturbed during his puja. And that's a long puja. Actually, Pratap Singh had taken a strict vow not to leave his quarters between 5 a.m. and 12 noon for any reason whatsoever, just to focus on his puja, to give pleasure to his Govinda deity. And in case an important matter came up, he had arranged for his chief minister, whose name was Jaya Chand, to attend to it, no matter how urgent it was. So one day at 8 a.m. in the morning, while Raj Pratap Singh was, not in the middle, but his puja had been going on for some time, Jaipur was suddenly attacked by an infamous Mughal ruler and his large, ferocious army. And of course, Jaipur has a wall all around the city, so these soldiers were attacking the wall and trying to get in, and surprise attack. So within minutes, Jai Chand came running to Pratap Singh's quarters to inform him. But he stopped short, thinking, if I disturb the king in his worship, he'll have my head, literally. So rather than knocking and entering into Raj Pratap Singh's quarters, he stood by, ringing a bell, hoping to get the king's attention. But nothing happened, because Pratap Singh was so absorbed in his seva. This is a very famous pastime in Jaipur, even to this day. So during this time, his troops started to rally in the main courtyard of the city. But without their king, without their leader, they were hesitant to go into battle. So this was a very critical situation. Many of the citizens were becoming hopeless, having experienced that whatever happened, their king never left his quarters between 5:30 and noon, no matter what. But then suddenly, to the amazement of both the citizens and the ministers and the soldiers, Raj Pratap Singh came out of his quarters at around 8:30, dressed from head to toe for battle. He had all his weapons. So it was a tradition amongst Rajput kings that before they went into battle, they would first perform a very elaborate puja, or worship, of their sword. So gathering all his generals and, top soldiers and ministers, Pratap Singh worshipped his sword. And it's described as the enemy soldiers were climbing over the walls surrounding the city. He's doing puja to his sword. After worshiping his sword, his main queen, came forward as per tradition, and cutting her thumb on a sharp edge of the sword, wiped her blood like tilak on the forehead of her husband, Pratap Singh, while calling out 3 times very loudly, Vijayi Bhava, Vijayi Bhava, Vijayi Bhava, which means, you will be victorious, you will be victorious, you will be victorious. This was the tradition before going into battle. He went in with blood tilak. Hare Krishna. So then, mounting his horse, Pratap Singh charged out of the main gate of Jaipur with his army right behind him. But it was really Pratap Singh, it said, who practically single-handedly cut down Mughal soldiers one after another. He was a large man, and his sword was said to be more than 3 times the size of any sword at that time. And you can still see some of these swords in the Jaipur Palace, downtown in Jaipur. They have a museum there, and you can see all this weaponry. So his sword was 3 times the size of everybody else's. And it said in that battle, he cut over 300 men in half, starting from here, from head down to the toe, like that, with his double-edged sword, which was sharp as a razor. It's written that his soldiers had never seen him so ferocious in battle. He was like a different person, slaughtering the enemy while showing no mercy and no fatigue. It's also noted. He didn't seem to get tired. It said that just by his roaring, he killed enemy soldiers. His roar was enough to kill an opponent. Powerful man. However, at one point in the fight, an enemy soldier got close enough to pierce his leg with a lance, a sharp lance. And as blood flowed from that wound, Pratap Singh turned and with one swoop killed the lancer. But it was a big wound. Finally, after 4 hours, every one of the invading army, including their king, lay dead on the battlefield. It's described as a lake of blood. And as Pratap Singh, the victorious king, left the battlefield and entered back into the city, he was received by his citizens with cheers of Jai Ho, Jai Ho, Jai Ho, as well as drummers in the Nakar Khana. Remember the Nakar Khana? It's the drum house. And there were several hundred drummers in that drum house playing their drums, welcoming him back. There was a great celebration until everyone saw the bloodied bandage. There was a bandage around his thigh. They saw this bloodied bandage on his leg. And they were worried. They heard he'd been pierced by a lance. So then, covered in dust and dirt, his clothes ripped and torn, and hobbling from the wound in his leg, he entered back into his quarters at 12 p.m., which was meant to be the time he finished his puja. But here's the interesting part. Here's the mysterious part, the transcendental part. No sooner had he entered back into his quarters than the door swung open again, and he walked out in fresh clothes, bright-faced, and with no bloody bandage on his leg. He was fine. So his generals and his soldiers and his ministers and citizens, they all stood before him in disbelief. For he'd actually been in his quarters no less than 2 seconds. So finally his chief minister, Jai Chand, spoke up. Your Royal Highness, he said to the king, how is it that you stand before us in fresh cloth with a smiling face and no wound on your leg? There's no bloodied bandage on your leg. So the king was confused. Like, what do you mean? He said, why should I appear differently? I've just come from my morning worship. I have not left my quarters since early morning. No, Your Royal Highness, Jaichand said. You left your quarters hours ago, worshipped your sword, rode into battle, and defeated the enemy. And you were wounded. We all saw it. So at that point, both the king, Raj Pratap Singh, his ministers and the generals and the people, they all stood there like dumbfounded, like unable to understand what's transpired here. So Pratap Singh was a great devotee. We would say Raja Rishi, a saintly person sitting on the throne. He was Krishna conscious. So trying to figure out what's transpired, after a few moments he looked at the sky and he shouted, "Oh Govinda, oh Govinda, oh Govinda, it can only be you." Then he turned to his generals and his ministers and he said, "Follow me." So making their way to Surya Mahal, the main temple where Radha Govinda reside, they arrived and stood before the closed altar. There was a big curtain there. The altar was closed, big curtain in front. And everyone was wondering why the king had brought them there. Like, why did we come here? Then Pratap Singh, with one grand movement of his arm, he ordered the pujari to open the curtain. And as the pujari did so, and the people saw the Lord, they gasped, and many of them fainted on the ground. For there before them, standing with dust all over him, in torn clothes, with a blood-stained cloth wrapped around his upper leg, was Govindaji, with a smile on his face, playing his flute. Hare Krishna. Whoa. It was the Lord who had assumed the form of the king and went out to defend Jaipur. So as word spread, hundreds, then thousands, and then tens of thousands of people came running to see Govindaji, offering their prayers and their gratitude, realizing that it was he who had ridden out on that horse, looking like Pratap Singh. And practically single-handedly, of course, without difficulty, defeated the attacking army. And the citizens, they also offered prayers to their king, Pratap Singh, whose devotion to the Lord caused the Lord, out of his love for his devotee, to cover for him in time of need. Hare Krishna. Isn't that an amazing pastime? So this pastime, this amazing story, is still recounted by the people of Jaipur to this very day. It's actually woven into the fabric of the history of Jaipur, the city of victory. Of course, some may find it all too incredulous. To them, I finish today with a quote from the Holy Bible, from Matthew 14:28-31. And I quote, "One time, the disciples of Jesus saw him walking on water toward their boat in the middle of the night. The Apostle Peter said, 'Lord Jesus, if that is you, command me to join you by walking on the water too.' So Jesus said, 'Yes, come.' Then Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water towards Jesus. But when the wind came up, he became afraid, and as he started to sink in the water, he cried out, 'Lord, save me.' Jesus reached out with his hand and caught him, but said, 'O you of little faith, why did you doubt?' O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" Hare Krishna. So, Prabhu, thank you so much. I've so much enjoyed researching this series about Srila Rupa Goswami, about Govindaji, about the kings of Jaipur, and all of these wonderful pastimes that we've discussed over the last few weeks. A little sad it's over, but maybe one day more will be revealed to us. But for now, we'll return. We'll come back and next lecture, as I mentioned, we'll talk about Madan Mohan and his stay in Jaipur and how he ended up in Karoli, nearby Karoli. And again, then the next week, we'll go back to Braj and we'll wander again in the 12 forests. So it's been so enjoyable, so refreshing, so enlivening. So thank you. See you in a couple of days. Shri Shri Gaur Nitai ki, Shri Krishna Balaram ki, Shri Shri Radha Shama Sundar ki, Vrindavaneshwari Shrimati Radharani ki, Shri Shri Radha Govinda Devi ki, Shri Rupa Goswami ki, Shri Prabhupada ki, Gaura Premanandi. Jai Jai Sri Sri Radhe Sham. Hare Krishna.